It was a dark and stormy night. This small sentence carries with it a lot of baggage, as an oft-mocked example of purple prose, writing that draws attention to itself. The earliest known use of this exact combination of words goes back as far as 1809 with Washington Irving, in his book Knickerbocker's History of New York. It was a dark and stormy night when the good Antonio arrived at the creek, which separates the island of Mannahatta from the mainland. But the sentence's infamy comes from its use as the opening line of the 1830 novel Paul Clifford by Edward Bulwer Lytton. It was a dark and stormy night. The rain fell in torrents, except at occasional intervals when it was checked by a violent gust of wind which swept up the streets, for it is in London that our scene lies, rattling along the housetops and fiercely agitating the scanty flame of the lamps that struggled against the darkness. Old Eddie here is something of a complicated literary figure, a very prolific writer of his time, total BFFs with Charles Dickens, and he coined a number of phrases that remain in our lexicon to this day. The pen is mightier than the sword. Yeah, that was him. But now he's more of a scholarly punchline for his melodrama, his flowery, overwritten prose. There's an annual bad writing contest named after him. The line, "It was a dark and stormy night," becoming a mantra of bad writing. The line persisted. It could be found in some of the early English translations of The Three Musketeers around 1846. It was parodied in Stephen Leacock's nonsense novels in 1911, and most famously in Charles Schulz's Peanuts. Snoopy would begin every one of his attempted novels with this line, cementing it as a signifier of bad, pompous writing. And it's interesting because, in isolation, this phrase, "it was a dark and stormy night," isn't really that bad. It's just descriptive and actually pretty minimal. The night isn't dark as the heart of a killer, or stormy as the turbulence of war, or any of the things attributed to purple prose. It's two basic adjectives and a common noun. It's only within a cultural context that the sentence becomes a laughable cliche. It's not something that's wrong, but something that society says is wrong. To open a book with it earnestly, not to make fun of it, not even really to reference it, just to use it as the simple descriptive sentence it is, would almost feel like a literary act of defiance. It was a dark and stormy night. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murray, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat on the foot of her bed and watched the trees tossing in the frenzied lashing of the wind. Madeleine L'Engle's science fiction fantasy novel, A Wrinkle in Time, is not interested in the decorum of quote-unquote good writing, which is not to say that it's bad. The book is an exhilarating work of what we would now categorize as young adult fiction, but it doesn't want to play by the rules from its first sentence onward. This is the story of three children, older sister Meg, younger brother Charles Wallace, and their new friend Calvin, who are enlisted by three witches, who are also dimension-hopping winged centaurs pretending to be witches, who are also actual stars that turned into dimension-hopping winged centaurs pretending to be witches, to travel across the galaxy and save Meg and Charles Wallace's astrophysicist father, who has been kidnapped by It, a satanic telepathic brain ruling over the planet of Camazot. And the only way to defeat It is with the power of love. In such a condensed form, A Wrinkle in Time sounds silly. And that's because it is silly. It opens with "It's a dark and stormy night," for Pete's sake. Madeleine L'Engle wrote all manners of silly books. The sequels to this book includes one where the kids shrink to a submolecular level with an angel to save their school principal. Then there's the one where Charles Wallace time travels with a Pegasus to stop a nuclear war. Oh, and my favorite is Many Waters, where two twin boys touch a computer, get zapped into the time of Noah, and get really horny. But if they have sex, they can't touch the unicorns. The silliness extends into the finer details. All the characters have eccentricities that can make them feel unrealistic. Charles Wallace is the major example here. A 5-year-old with an advanced vocabulary and a borderline unsettling amount of maturity and wisdom for a child just barely out of the toddler stage, with an innate ability that could be described as empathetic reading of other people. "You mean you read our minds?" Charles Wallace looked troubled. "I don't think it's that. It's being able to understand a sort of language, Like, sometimes if I concentrate very hard, I can understand the wind talking with the trees. You tell me, you see, sort of inadvertently. That's a good word, isn't it? I got Mother to look it up in the dictionary for me this morning. I really must learn to read, except I'm afraid it will make it awfully hard for me in school next year if I already know things. I think it'll be better if people go on thinking I'm not very bright. They won't hate me quite so much. Children don't speak like this, even the young prodigies of our real world. Calvin speaks in an equally lyrical manner, though at least he's a teenager. Meg is by far the closest thing to a normal kid in this book. She has a great deal of anxiety towards growing up, towards her physical appearance, but she still lives a unique life with 2 top-of-their-field scientists for parents, and finds it easier to accept it when witches are spouting words like tesseract. There's plenty she doesn't understand when she's whisked away into the fantasy adventure, but at no point is she disbelieving, never having that classic refusal of the call moment. She's just confused sometimes. While the nearest thing the book provides to an audience surrogate, even Meg is distanced from the reader in a layer of unreality. It's perhaps apt to compare A Wrinkle in Time to another popular children's fantasy book from around this time, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Written only 11 years prior, C.S. Lewis's most famous book seems to share a lot of structure and even a few ideas with Wrinkle. Both are books about children from the modern world discovering an alternative reality beyond their own, one of witches and centaurs and magic, one that has been corrupted by evil. The children must complete a quest to remove evil's influence, and then they can return to their own world. Both books have a subplot about one of the children being seduced by an evil influence, causing him to turn against the other children for a time, but snaps out of it and redeems themselves. Both books were written by Christians with very strong faiths. C.S. Lewis was an Orthodox Anglican, and Madeleine L'Engle was an Episcopalian, and both folded Christian ideas into their works. Lewis aimed more for allegory and allusion, while L'Engle opted to just name-drop Jesus and quote Bible verses. It's a blunter means of theming compared to Lewis, and in many ways A Wrinkle in Time is a blunter book that almost seems to antagonize anyone trying to treat it as well-produced prose. The children in Lewis's Narnia series are very simplistic characters that aren't all that special outside of their role in the occasional prophecy. By having barely beyond the most basic characterizations, it allows, at least in theory, for the young readers to slip into these roles and imagine themselves stepping in through the wardrobe and discovering a fawn by the lamppost. They're vehicles for imagination. The children in A Wrinkle in Time may have a thing or two in common with you, the reader, but they are not all that interested in you being in their shoes. They have their own worries and anxieties and 2 scoops of weirdness to keep you from really getting comfortable in that way, which makes them the ideal protagonist for a book where the main villain is conformity itself. The planet of Camazotz is a finely tuned machine, every person living there going through a set routine of work and play, right down to the second. Even the children. Not only do the children have to play the exact same game at the exact same time, they have to bounce their balls in perfect rhythm with each other. Any divergence is immediately stamped out through frighteningly vague re-education programs. It's human existence dictated by clockwork precision as composed by an almighty computer. It is, perhaps, what some people were feeling in the rise of post-war economic modernism, the rise of suburbia and mass-produced identical housing, when people who didn't align with the given political parties are arrested and put on trial for not being properly American. The rise of skyscrapers and the pencil-pushing capitalist industries imprisoned within them. Camazotz is steel and concrete and perfect nuclear families. In our direct narrative comparison, Camazotz takes the place of Narnia, but that's looking at it from the wrong way around. This isn't the story of modern real-world children traveling to a world of fantasy, but a story of fantasy children traveling to a modern real world of satanic bureaucracy. The visual metaphors here are, like all things in Wrinkle, ham-fisted. It, the evil entity controlling the planet, is a massive brain, intelligent but without caring, and Meg manages to defeat it by introducing it to the concept of love. The love she shares between her and her brother, dismantling any sort of robotic logic coming from it. Is this a simple idea? Oh yes. Is it silly? Very. But it is also what a character fantasy would do. And I don't mean fantasy in the unicorns and wizards sense, but Madeleine L'Engle's personal definition of fantasy, the explorations in search of truth beyond mere facts.
Now, thinking forwards involves believing in things that are impossible. I think, like the White Queen in Alice in Wonderland, we should believe 7 impossible things every morning before breakfast. It's a very good practice. If when I was your age, I had looked at any evening news, I would not have believed it. But we do have the capacity to change. And that is often urged on and helped by fantasy. Fantasy is trying to move to that truth, which is beyond truth. Fantasy is going beyond easy possibilities to the possibilities which are much harder, which open us and push us.
The goal of A Wrinkle in Time isn't for you to step in the shoes of these children and participate in their adventures, but to discern the truths of their fantasy. Realism isn't required. Suspension of disbelief is an overrated idea. Fiction isn't water cooler gossip about fake people. It is crafted meaning. I mentioned a moment ago that A Wrinkle in Time quotes the Bible. The most direct quote comes right near the end, right before Meg is to step up in this final confrontation with it. Each of the book's 3 witches, Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch, give Meg something to assist in this conflict. Mrs. Who's gift is to quote Corinthians, chapter 1, verse 25 to 29. What I have to give you this time you must try to understand not word by word, but in a flash, as you understood the Tesseract. Listen, Meg, listen well. The foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For you see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble, are called. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And base things of the world, and things which are despised, hath God chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring not things that are. I'm not much of a Christian these days, but I do like this passage, where God has chosen the irregular, the confounding, the despised to represent him over the intelligent, the rich, the powerful. God sides with non-traditional heroes. After all, when it comes time to send his son into the world, he could have had Jesus born a prince, born someone with built-in cultural advantage to being heard. But instead, Jesus was born into a working-class family belonging to a suppressed, occupied people. Taken as a character, Jesus is as much a contradiction as the protagonist of this book, coming from a relatable place, but not being truly relatable himself. Jesus Christ, the carpenter who is also the Son of God. Charles Wallace, the 5-year-old who talks like a 60-year-old. And yet, you accept Charles Wallace, his idiosyncratic existence, because these characters aren't the best by popular narrative standards, but fantasies to speak to truths of love and compassion over cold mechanical intelligence. And this is, I believe, why the book opens with "It was a dark and stormy night." One of the most mocked sentences in English literature. It is the weak thing to confound the mighty, a despised thing, as Meg is despised by her classmates, as irregularities are despised by it on Camazotz, as the book can be despised for its sidestepping of literary tradition. It is the first misfit toy in an island of misfit toys, letting you know that this isn't fact, this isn't high literature. This book is a wonderful, fantastical mistake, as we all are.